Where's JP Bryan? Okay, I want to make sure you're here. Our final speaker today is JP Bryan. He's been active in the oil and gas business for more than 20 years. He's the Senior Managing Director of Torch Energy and serves on the Board of Directors of AutoNation Mission Resources and Torch Energy Advisors. JP has been involved in Texas history for many years. He has a very strong historic preservation background with a special interest in San Jacinto. He served on the Board of Trustees for the Institute of Texan Cultures. He was appointed in 1996 to the Texas Historical Commission, where he still is a member, and he served as past president of the Texas State Historical Association. The theme today is personalities of San Jacinto. We've touched on several of the most important, many of the important people, but of course there are so many others at San Jacinto, it's hard to talk about all of them. JP has studied quite a few of these individuals. He's going to talk about some of the famous ones, the lesser known ones, and he will answer the mysterious question of who wears the coat of many colors. So JP, please come up.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Sure. Nice introduction there. I don't have any slides for you. I've always felt like that if you had a good talk, that ought to do the job. And we're going to find out about the talk here pretty quick. 21 years ago, roughly today, I delivered a valedictory address about the Battle of San Jacinto. It's part of my duties as president of the Texas State Historical Association. The inspiration for the speech was my father having chosen the Battle of Velasco as a subject nearly 20 years earlier, when he served in a similar capacity. The Battle of Velasco, you might recognize, was the first armed conflict of the Texas Revolution, at least arguably. I decided to choose San Jacinto, the last conflict, as my subject. Now, I did so with a certain measure of trepidation, because I wondered if there was truly anything worth saying about this battle that hadn't already been said. I had a special connection, however, with that event, in that three of my relatives played a somewhat important role in the Texas Revolution. My grandfather, William Joel Bryan, served under Stephen F. Austin at the storming of Behar, where old Ben Milam was killed, and Joel got the measles, a childhood disease to which many soldiers in the Texas Army were not immune. Joel was so stricken that he nearly died and was home recuperating during Sam Houston's retreat across the face of Texas. My uncle Moses Austin Bryan enlisted as an aide-de-camp to Austin and later Houston. As a matter of fact, if you are familiar with McCall's painting of the Army after the Battle of San Jacinto gathered around Sam Houston, it is my uncle Moses who is translating the first conversation that occurred between Santa Anna and Houston. Guy Bryan, the youngest member of the family, accompanied his mother in the famous runaway scrape. As I began my historical investigation, I was appalled to find that there were few accurate published facts about the Battle of San Jacinto. And nothing I discovered, by the way, is going to change the outcome of this battle. We clearly won this conflict. But what became painfully apparent to me was the fact that many of the historical writings about this battle were largely wrong, but they were consistently plagiarized by follow-on historians, which incidentally gave me a somewhat dim view of the profession of historian. So I set out to write my own book about the engagement, and can have continued that effort now for 21 years. So I want to tell you, it has elevated considerably my opinion now of published historians. And I might say my research is being done with a bit more resolve, and I have set a drop-dead date for myself as of April the 21st next year. Throughout my investigations of the battle, I came to be very familiar, almost personal friends, it seemed to me, with many of the colorful characters involved in this seminal battle in the western settlement of these United States. Lesser-known luminaries had a significant influence on the battle's outcome. By the way, all the people that I have chosen to speak about today, I have chosen from the winner's side, although there are clearly some heroic figures in the Mexican camp. It just seemed to me more appropriate that if we're going to pick the most valuable player award, it ought to be from those that were on the side of victory, not defeat. Now, I intend to award, before this is over today, the coat of many colors to one individual whose conduct stands above all the rest. As you know, Joseph's father, Jacob, awarded the coat of many colors to him other than his brothers, of which there were 10. Now, we're not going to highlight 10 individuals, so relax. I've reduced the head count to 6. And we're going to do this in sort of the hit parade technique by starting off with the least laudable of this band of unique American heroes. The first is Dick the drummer. He, Dick the drummer, was given this sobriquet by Frank Talbot in his book, The Day of San Jacinto. He referred to Dick as a big Negro slave who beat Reveille on April 21st. In 1850, an Austin paper printed this article, which in turn was reprinted in the Houston Gazette. It said as follows: in speaking of the San Jacinto dinner, we inadvertently admitted a notice of Dick, the venerable drummer of the Battle of San Jacinto. This gray-headed descendant of Ham, honor to the patriotic old man. His name will be handed down to posterity with those of the immortal heroes who wear the well-earned laurels plucked upon the deathless plains of San Jacinto. Interestingly, both Talbot and the paper failed to mention his name. Well, we can establish from written correspondence and land conveyances that Dick was not large, but a man of modest build. He had a real name. It was Richard Robinson. He came to Texas in 1835. He was not a slave, but a free man of light color, a mulatto. If you recall the biblical account of Josephus under siege by the Amorites, he chose at God's suggestion to put the band out in front of the army, I guess to entice them to attack. Now, Josephus was very warm to this idea, probably because he did not serve in the band and would be observing the contest from a distant hill. But I think what similarly great courage did those who served in the musical corps in the 19th century exhibit. The participants at San Jacinto were clearly no exception. Without divine intervention, armor, or weapon, they braved the battlefield, playing what is generally thought to have been Thomas Moore's love song, Will You Come to the Bower? Actually, the song they did play was a Texas rendition of Yankee Doodle, led in large measure by Dick the drummer, or Richard Robinson, as he should be known. Robinson did not end his career, interestingly enough, on the San Jacinto battlefield. He joined the Milam Guard in 1842 to willingly participate in an invasion or defense against Mexico if required. He also served with considerable distinction in the Mexican-American War in the battles of Monterey and Buena Vista. Recognizing his heroism at San Jacinto is a credit not only to him, but to a long line of military musicians who shared in a gene pool filled with musical talent and enormous courage. On April 21st, Richard and his 4 cohorts led a vengeful band of Texans straight into the jaws of battle and to a final victory. And to him goes our enduring admiration. The next individual to deserve consideration is our 5th candidate, one of the more intriguing personalities of the entire San Jacinto campaign. He was James H. Perry, who joined the Texas Army as Houston's aide-de-camp. After the battle, in about 1847, Houston claimed that James H. Perry was a spy for the Mexican government Was that true? Probably not. Perry attended West Point for 3 years, but didn't graduate, apparently infatuated with the idea and romance of the Texas Revolution. He joined a New York regiment of 158 volunteers, and after numerous delays, including arrest at sea by the British, reached Houston on the Brazos River in late March. Because of his training at West Point, Houston enlisted Perry. During the Battle of San Jacinto, Perry was with Sidney Sherman's 2nd Regiment of Volunteers. After the battle, he was placed in command of the Lower Brazos until he departed to New York, where he joined the ministry. There he became a pastor of the Episcopal Methodist Church. That's not a typo, that's what they called it. Principally in the New York diocese until 1862, when he left the pulpit to serve in the U.S. military. He died in 1863. Now, Perry made a very fatal mistake on his trip to Texas. He criticized Sam Houston in a letter addressed to Reuben Potter, accusing Houston of inconsistent conduct, poor command, and being under the influence of opium. Houston read the letter and had Perry arrested, claiming he was a spy, not for Potter, but for the Mexicans. He released Perry before the Battle of San Jacinto, where Perry distinguished himself on the field, according to the accounts of both General Rusk and General Wharton. For some 20 years, Perry and Houston exchanged verbal salvos. Perry charged Houston with incompetence in handling the San Jacinto campaign, and most especially on the field of battle. Now, Houston responded in like coin on at least 3 occasions. The most famous response being a speech delivered to the United States Senate in 1859. Houston encapsulated some 23 years of distaste for those that had criticized his performance at San Jacinto. He singled out Perry for the following: that Perry got mixed up with a free Negro girl in New Orleans whom he tried to sell, that he was a spy for the Mexicans, that he'd come with a Mexican passport, and if not for Houston's clemency, Perry would have been executed in Texas for communicating with the enemy. Now, none of these accusations against Perry hold up under scrutiny, but they are very revealing because they show the lengths to which Houston would go to protect his image as a hero of San Jacinto. But there is a more interesting, unpublished fact about Perry's involvement in the San Jacinto campaign. Perry may actually have killed the hero of this campaign from the Mexican side, and that would have been General Castrillon. A hint of this fact appeared in a foreword to a book about Perry entitled Perry's Saints, published in 1868. But Henry Foote, the historian, recounts Castrillon's death, supposedly quoting Rusk, who said Castrillon folded his arms in disgust and was shot in the back by the charging Texans. Legend has taken up this report, even though it goes in the face of reports of Santa Anna, Cairo, and Delgado. These revealing comments, however, were finally discovered in a eulogy of Colonel Perry by his lifelong friend and fellow pastor, the Reverend Kennedy. Kennedy writes, "On the first fire of the enemy, General Houston was wounded, and General Rusk took command of the right wing, and the command of the left wing devolved to Colonel Perry." Historians would disagree with that, but makes a good story at this point. This position brought Colonel Perry in immediate contact with the officer commanding the right wing of the Mexican forces, who was supposed to be Santa Anna, but was in fact General, as he says, General Castillo. Perry engaged with him in a sword fight. They were upon their saddles, and for a few moments their contest was desperate. At length Castillo fell. The encounter with General Castillo was a matter of lifelong regret to Colonel Perry, end of quote. Obviously, Castillo should be Castrillon. This account is all the more believable because the killing of Castrillon, the most respected of Mexican commanders, is not something any soldier would acknowledge easily or falsely, much less a man in Perry's profession, we hope. Now, that takes us to our next candidate. A little background. You know, one of the great unsolved mysteries is how the Texas Army could have surprised the Mexicans at 4:30 in the afternoon. There is no one in the Mexican army who has recounted the battle who satisfactorily explains why the entire force of over 1,000 Mexicans, with over 100 muleteers and numerous camp followers, could not have observed the gathering Texas army. The various members of the Mexican army could have been distracted by some activity is certainly understandable, but the entire army? Legend has certainly given Santa Anna one of the most exciting excuses, and which proves for all of us that sex does sell. Legend holds that a mulatto slave girl named Emily Morgan, who belonged to Colonel James Morgan, had been left at Morgan's Point. She was captured by Santa Anna and his army on about the 19th. Supposedly Santa Anna was enjoying her companionship when the Texans charged, or as Henderson Shuffler used to love to say, giving her all in the cause for Texas freedom. In recent publications, ample recognition, or in many publications, has been given to Miss Morgan for her services in the cause of Texas freedom, further identifying her for the inspiration for the song, The Yellow Rose of Texas. The authentication for Miss Morgan's participation in the battle is found in a footnote in William Bullert's book, A Trip to Texas, in which he reports, the Battle of San Jacinto was probably lost to the Mexicans owing to the influence of lost by the Mexicans, owing to the influence of a mulatto girl, Emily, belonging to Colonel Morgan, who was closeted in a tent with Santa Anna. Now, this footnote, incidentally, was not a footnote by Bullard, but it had been put in there by a later date writer. The writer says this was a well-known fact reported by Mexican historians. Unfortunately, there is no contemporary Mexican source that mentions this. The best evidence for its non-existence is that Cairo, Santa Anna's personal secretary, who was present at San Jacinto. As a matter of fact, he was sitting literally outside his tent. Missed few, if any, opportunities to criticize Santa Anna's every move in a publication about 4 years later. It seems apparent that if Santa Anna was engaged in a love affair while the battle heated up ferociously, his Mexican critics would not have let this event pass without giving it proper amplification. Could there be a different interpretation, though? To keep a little of the legend alive, it is, of course, possible that in the general's Latin culture, this would have been conduct that could have been condoned, even admired. So maybe not mentioning it was a way to continue the criticism of Santa Anna. To the extent that Emily was the inspiration for the song, The Yellow Rose of Texas, documentation is totally lacking. The title Yellow Rose certainly makes reference to a Haya or mulatto Negro woman, but there is not one word in the song that gives any mention of San Jacinto. Its first copyright date was not until 1958. The song's only reference to a place is the Rio Grande, which incidentally was not the preferred description of the river in 1836. Now, folklorists clearly have made at least two mistakes in describing Emily. One, they presumed she was a slave, and two, they ascribed to her the last name Morgan. In 1835, James Morgan brought two free Negro women from New York to provide him household services. One was a washerwoman, the other, Emily D. West, providing unknown services. In addition, folklorists overlooked the following document in the Texas archives. In 1837, I.N. Moreland made a petition on behalf of Emily D. West for a passport, saying she was a free woman, 36 years of age, who came to Texas in October of 1835. Moreland went on to claim he had met her for the first time in 1836 at San Jacinto, and then added that she had lost the papers that established her free status at San Jacinto in April of 1836. Now, Moreland himself was at San Jacinto. As a matter of fact, he was captain of the regular artillery. So it's interesting. Why would Moreland go to the trouble to gain the passport for a household servant, unless she had made some special contribution to the cause of Texas freedom. That there was an Emily at San Jacinto seems certain. Whether she spent time in the tent, well, you decide. That brings us to our next individual. The next three, as far as I'm concerned, are almost interchangeable in who truly deserves the coat of many colors. In this man, the legend of what it means to be a hero merges with the reality of hero. I refer to none other than Thomas Jefferson Rusk. He joined Houston on the 4th of April near Gross's plantation. At this point, there was considerable turmoil in the Mexican army, in the Texan army. He had been sent there by Burnet to force Houston to do battle. Instead, he calmed Houston's critics and pacified a mutinous army. He followed Houston faithfully, though there is clearly some evidence that at the famous fork in the road, he directed the army to go to San Jacinto. Now, I discount that. I do not think there's any doubt that when Houston hit the fork in the road, he knew he wasn't going to turn left, because he'd have been the only guy going left. In following Houston with an arousing speech the night before crossing Buffalo Bayou to meet with Santa Anna, Rusk roared forth, "Remember the Alamo, remember La Bahia." Insisting he had said enough, he shouted, "I am done." But he certainly wasn't done with his contribution to Texas freedom. He led Sherman's men as the charge began and then crossed over and joined Burleson as the Texas force swept into the Mexican camp. He encouraged the army to continue routing the enemy after Houston supposedly ordered a cessation to the hostilities. He seemed to favor everyone and no one. Each participant from Houston to Perry counted him as a friend. He was a sensitive man who, after the loss of his beloved wife, took his own life. Interestingly, it was only after Rusk's death that Sam Houston felt at liberty to attack his critics from the floor of the United States Senate. The best evidence of the personal regard in which the Texas Army held him lay in their refusal to accept Lamar, the poet president of the Republic of Texas, as their commander-in-chief, and insisted on Rusk receiving the appointment. 3 times he was elected United States Senator. Twice he was elected Texas governor. And 1 time, the hero of San Jacinto. Now, that brings us to our next man. One step away from the top. He is the commander of the 1st Regiment of Volunteers and the old Indian fighter himself, Edward Burleson. His conduct at San Jacinto cannot be summed up as one exceptional act meshed into a lifetime of mediocrity, but one in a series of heroic acts. He was a hero of over 32 battles. This was a role to which he was born. Life's events honed his natural talents like the blade of a skinning knife. He was part of a frontier family continually on the move and fighting to keep their land. In 1813, at the age of 15, he participated in the famous Battle of Horseshoe Bend. A gallant boy soldier, he gained the praise of the commander of that battle, who was none other than Andrew Jackson, and the esteem of a young and courageous lieutenant by the name of Sam Houston. In 1830, he moved to Texas with his wife, Sarah, and 6 children. As a matter of fact, he got married when he was 16 years of age. And he received a grant in Austin's 2nd colony near present-day Bastrop. Called by necessity and provoked by circumstance, Burleson found himself engaged in an exercise that had become second nature, fighting Indians. In 1835, the Mexicans were apparently nervous about losing their hold on Texas and sent Coss with reinforcements to secure the town of Behar. Texas responded in kind. Stephen F. Austin was elected commander-in-chief of the Army. At Gonzales in October 1835, Burleson was elected commander of the only regiment organized under Austin. He then proceeded to Behar with Austin to oppose Coss. After Austin resigned as commander-in-chief and was sent to the United States as commissioner on a fundraising and also on a fundraising effort, which incidentally I think requires a lot more courage than going to battle. Burleson succeeded him as commander of the Texas Army. With the encouragement of a few Texas heroes such as Ben Milam, Burleson's men were persuaded to invade Behar, where they overran the forces under Coss. Coss signed a treaty agreeing never to return to Texas and was sent back to Mexico. After Houston took command of the Texas Army, he called for an election to organize the volunteers into a regiment. Burleson was elected colonel and second in command of the Army under Houston. Burleson then played a role he was neither suited for nor that satisfied him. Burleson followed Houston as he began a painful retreat across a major portion of civilized Texas. Ironically, throughout the San Jacinto campaign, though, Burleson showed little disposition to take over the Army. He demonstrated that he could be a loyal follower as well as a fearless leader. On the 20th of April, when facing the Mexican Army, Sidney Sherman requested permission to draw the enemy into the open. Houston reluctantly acquiesced. Sherman recalled, "I immediately applied to Colonel Burleson for permission to call on his regiment for volunteers for that purpose. The colonel told me I could take all who would volunteer if I wanted them, and I would parade the balance of my regiment and march out to sustain them if necessary." Sherman did so and received heavy opposition from the Mexican Army. The 1st Regiment under Burleson immediately marched out to their aid. Houston countermanded Burleson's orders and told them to countermarch. Now that didn't have a very salutary effect on either Sherman, who was nearly killed in the encounter, or Burleson, who felt he could easily have defeated the Mexicans. The next morning on the 21st, Coss, who had surrendered to Burleson at the siege at Bear and swore in writing he would never again cross the Rio Grande to Texas, arrived. This was a man whom Burleson had taken at his word, and his word had been broken. In the afternoon of that day, Houston called a council of war and proposed a question of whether the Texans should attack. The thinking was that they should await a Mexican attack since their encampment was nearly impregnable. All officers except Millard and Wells voted not to attack. Houston did not vote or announce any decision. He began to grill Burleson, repeatedly asking him if his men would fight. The colonel assured him that he knew his men and they would fight. Losing patience with Houston's insinuations about the courage of his regiment, he emphatically declared that if there were a coward in his regiment, he would personally shoot him down. Houston became concerned with how Texans might escape in the event of a defeat. He suggested that Burleson send out a detail to build rafts for such purpose. Burleson, who was seething at this point, replied, according to one account, "I will give the order, but it will not be obeyed. These boys did not come here to build bridges and boats, but to fight. Besides, they have no saws, axes, or materials to build boats. They are ready to die fighting." Houston, "Every man ready?" Burleson answered, "Yes." Burleson then went back to his men and asked for a vote at the best time for attacking the enemy, immediately or at 4 o'clock the next morning. After some consultation, Burleson returned and said, "Captains, parade your companies. The other regiment has decided to fight immediately, and I don't want mine to be 1 minute behind." The troops formed up, and Houston rode out to the front of Burleson's regiment to lead the attack. Burleson went into battle, all 5'11", 180 pounds of him, on a sorrel horse, wearing an Eton jacket, light blue in color. He had on a pair of corduroy trousers and a dark red sash around his waist with 2 pistols tied to the horn of his saddle. Burleson's 1st Regiment of Volunteers were at the center of the army. They would have to cross the wide open plain and then charge slightly uphill directly into the middle of the Mexican breastworks. At 4 o'clock, Burleson's command pressed forward the attack in perfect silence. They held their fire until they were only 60 yards of the Mexican breastworks. Then a deafening shout of "Remember the Alamo" was sent up from the line, and an outpouring of what was the first use in battle of the Texas yell, which later became the famous rebel yell. All participants in the battle, many of whom afterwards fought in the Civil War, remember it as the most impressive sound they'd ever heard. Rusk wrote, "The 1st Regiment, with the most deafening yell I ever heard, charged upon the breastworks. Even the Mexican officers who survived to write their versions recalled the dreadful effect on their men." Moses Austin Bryan reported, "Burleson's regiment, to which I belonged, was in the center and marched straight into the Mexican breastworks. Burleson took his men right over the breastworks, and the Mexicans who were not killed retreated. The most awful slaughter I ever saw was when the Texans began pursuing the retreating Mexicans, killing on all sides, even the wounded. Burleson had his sorrel horse shot out from under him. By nightfall, more than half the Mexican army had been killed, and most of the remainder captured. Texas casualties were light. The 1st Regiment, Burleson, suffered the heaviest casualties. The next day, Houston ordered Burleson to send out a squad in search of Santa Ana and round up any surviving Mexicans. Houston spent a most uncomfortable night wounded under a tree within Burleson's headquarters. Members of the Army suggested that they should pursue the Mexican divisions remaining at Fort Bend. Houston made numerous excuses as to why this exercise should not be permitted. Houston cried out, "Who would command you? You certainly know that I'm wounded." Colonel Ben Smith said, "Nothing, sir, would be lost by that. We can easily make a good commander." Colonel Coleman made the same request to the general who asked him, "Who would command the expedition?" To which Coleman replied, "The oldest colonel, General." "Who would that be?" He said, "Colonel Burleson, a man of unquestionable bravery," replied Coleman. "Just add to that," said the general, "a good man, but a fool." This was the first visible sign of dissatisfaction that Houston was to display for Burleson for the remainder of his life. The next morning, an attachment of men from Burleson's command captured Santa Ana. As word spread that the big dog of the tan yard had been captured and brought in, the entire Texas Army gave out a great cheer. On April 21st, Houston sent Burleson with Santa Ana's letters of surrender to Filosola, ordering him to immediately retreat from Texas. Filosola complied. Moses Austin Bryan, who accompanied Burleson, said that on numerous occasions Burleson was tempted to attack and capture the retreating Mexican force, but felt constrained to do so by the orders he had received from Houston. He followed them until they finally crossed the Rio Grande River. On June 1st, 1836, Burleson signed the discharges for the men who had served him so ably during the Revolution. But Burleson's service to the causes of Texas freedom continued uninterrupted for the next 6 years. He died on December at the age of 53. This following eulogy or tribute was paid to him at his death. He was the hero of 32 battles. He was never known to retreat. Brave without rashness, cautious without timidity, benevolent without weakness, he was the friend of the vanquished as he was the terror of the enemy. But it was not only as a soldier that General Burleson was conspicuous. He shone in the more peaceful walks of life. As a statesman, he long held a prominent position in Texas, as the Vice President of Texas, as a candidate for the presidency, as a senator of the legislature since annexation. In all these positions, he has been remarkable for his good sense, his honesty, his purity, and humility. No one who had so filled the public eye could have worn honors more meekly than General Burleson. He was a man of softness and delicacy of feeling. He was kind and gentle to his family and was a good man, and as such, we revere him. He was a patriot, and as such, we loved him. He was a benefactor, and for this, we praise him. That eulogy was delivered by Guy Morrison Bryan. Now, the last candidate, the winner of the coat of many colors, the last of the heroic characters of San Jacinto. There is no one who provided a better service to the cause of Texas freedom throughout the retreat, from the Colorado River, nor exceeded his contribution at the moment of war on the plains of San Jacinto. He was the Jeb Stuart of the Texicans, the eyes and ears of the Texas Army, and a loyal servant to his commander, Sam Houston. He was Erastus Deaf Smith. He proved to be a fearless scout and spy, seeking the enemy and habitually embracing danger. As his name implies, Deaf Smith was in fact nearly totally deaf, an affliction that probably resulted from a childhood disease, mumps, more likely. There is, however, a legendary account that Erastus lost his hearing diving for a rifle he dropped in the San Antonio River, but there is no factual support for this incident. However, a true little-known fact about Smith is that he just as well could have been known as Erastus Blind Smith. He was extremely myopic. He once mistook a herd of wild Mustangs for advancing Mexican cavalry. Smith's accomplishments on behalf of Texas freedom are all the more extraordinary considering he functioned with these two handicaps, near blindness and deafness. That would immediately disqualify him for almost any position in any regular army, most especially the Scouting and Spy Corps. We are not handing out, however, gratuitous compliments in saying that Smith executed his job with all the qualities of genius. Instinctively, he could define the problem and manufacture the solution. How do we defend that claim? The answer is simple. We don't. His life did. Consider these results. At the outset of hostilities, he joined the Texas Army under Austin, which was attacking Behar. He obtained reliable information that Coss's troops were either ready to surrender or mutiny, and reported such to Ballinger Stewart, who informed Stephen F. Austin, and in doing so commended Smith's aptitude for securing sensitive information. Smith was then sent by Austin to the consultation back at San Felipe to report his observations of the Mexican Army to Richard Royal, who reported that Smith was very importantly useful. He returned to Austin's army just in time to distinguish himself at the Battle of Concepcion. And 30 days later, at the so-called grass fight west of San Antonio, he excelled as a spy, locating and destroying the Mexican supply train, handling the Texans an important military advantage. When Ben Milam finally rallied the Texans to storm Behar, it was Smith who guided Francis Johnson's men into the city. Initially, the Mexican army put up a blistering response, especially near the Vermindi Palace. Their first return volley killed Milam at the entrance to the palace, and almost at that exact moment, severely wounded Deaf Smith, who had assumed a strategic position atop the palace. Now, Henry Smith, no relation to Deaf, responded to Smith's wounds with the following statement: in spite of his injuries, he can't leave this army. His services as a spy cannot well be dispensed with, and he is well known to us for all his vigilance and meritorious acts. Not one to be restrained, even by serious injuries, Smith returned to action, serving as a messenger for Travis. On the 15th of February, he left the Alamo and slipped through enemy lines and delivered Travis's famous liberty or death message to the government of Texas. In spite of his sometimes inconsistent conduct as a military commander, Colonel Travis could on occasion express himself with a rare eloquence. He said of Deaf Smith, "He is the bravest of the brave." Houston then sent him back to gather the truth and important news from the events surrounding the Alamo. Smith returned, not just with news about this darkest moment in Texas' struggle for freedom, but with its only survivors, Susanna Dickinson and the babe of the Alamo, her daughter Angelina. Houston gave Smith the rank of captain after this, as he began his retreat, or retrograde, as some complimentary historians would put it, across the face of Texas. He put him in charge of cavalry first and then the training of recruits, but Smith quickly gravitated to that role for which he was born, leader of the Texas Spy and Scouting Corps. Smith and his men consistently shadowed the movements of the Mexican Army and provided Houston reliable information on the whereabouts of the Mexicans throughout the entire campaign. A comparison of the Mexican and Texas armies reveals some very interesting strengths and weaknesses amongst the two, on both sides. But one place the Texans clearly had no equal in the Mexican Army, or maybe in any other army in the world, with Deaf Smith's scouting company. On the 18th of April, Smith handed Houston the Rosetta Stone for victory. He captured correspondence from Philosola on the Brazos River directed to Santa Anna, who was now at New Washington, burning down the town and, I guess, capturing the Yellow Rose. Now, Houston knew Santa Anna's exact location as a result of this captured correspondence. He also knew Santa Anna's exact troop strength, which incidentally was only 600, not the much larger numbers you may have heard. And, importantly, he knew he was well separated from the main body of his army on the Brazos River. On the 21st of April, the Texan leadership debated battle. Now, Smith was not a debater, so he took 5 men and returned along a much-traveled road to Vince's Bridge, which logically spanned Vince's bayou. He burned the bridge and returned just in time for battle. A debate rages today as who ordered this bridge destroyed. Houston later would claim he issued an order, doing so to prevent the Mexican army from retreating. Very dubious claim. The only sensible justification for destroying the bridge was to prevent further reinforcements to the Mexican army, as had occurred on the morning of the 21st when Coss arrived with some 400 soldiers. Members of Smith's spy company suggest it was Smith's idea, and this is very probable, because Smith, more than anyone else in Houston's army, including Houston himself, would have grasped the significance to the Mexican army of the bridge. Now, I'm convinced burning the bridge was the single most important event in the battle, but not for the reason the bridge was burned. It prevented the escape of Santa Anna. Had Santa Anna returned to the Brazos River, which is clearly where he was headed on the back of Old Whip, a horse he'd commanded from a gentleman that lived near Vince's Bridge, he would have been joined with his main army on the Brazos, which had recently been strengthened with the arrival of Urrea. Now, Urrea commanded one of the crack-fighting units in the Mexican army. If you followed his career, you know he suffered no defeats as he came up the coastline of Texas. Houston's army, heavily outnumbered, would have been no match for a regathered Santa Anna and his forces. San Jacinto would have been remembered only as a successful battle in a campaign which would have ended with Mexicans winning the war. At the battle, Smith joined with Lamar's cavalry, the 1st Texans, to breach the Mexican breastworks. After Smith went with Burleson to deliver the evacuation orders to Philosola and continued to serve under Rusk as a scout. He was awarded Rene Musqui's property in San Antonio by the Texas Congress for incomparable military service. He resigned from the Army in 1836, but was not through being a scourge to the Mexican Army. In 1837, he organized a ranger company and defeated a band of Mexicans at Laredo. His worldly services as Western America's greatest spy soldier ended in November of 1837. His commander, Sam Houston, got it right with these words about this remarkable man. My friend Deaf Smith, in my stay in my darkest hour, is no more. A man more brave and honest never lived. His soul is with God. His fame and his family must commend the care of his country. And when Rusk was finishing his speech on the 19th, he said, "And I have said enough and I'm done, and I have said enough and I'm done." Thank you.
Thank you, JP. We'll now take a 15-minute break. The last film we have is the next Hollywood film on the Battle of San Jacinto, which is from Man of Conquest, which was produced in 1939. This was a biography of Sam Houston. It was played by Richard Dix. And it's only a 10-minute segment. It includes the Battle of San Jacinto. It's noteworthy for its historical inaccuracies, but it is highly entertaining, like the other one was. Although I must say that Dix played Houston very well as a very strong, determined, confident leader. Among the most noteworthy errors are the fact that the entire army charges on horseback. There's no infantry at all in this scene. The Texas Army has a barrage of Conestoga wagons, which they really didn't have during the battle. You'll see the Lone Star flag, which didn't exist at that time. Sometimes the Lone Star flag is upside down, sometimes it's right side up. And if you notice, at some point, you see the original San Jacinto flag, but it's strategically covered by the Lone Star flag, perhaps because of the risque nature of the original San Jacinto flag. But most noteworthy is you'll see the huge mountains in the distance. Somehow or other, they just decided to film this in the Rocky Mountains. So now we'll see the Man of Conquest, and at the end of this movie, I'd like for the speakers to come up, and we'll have a 10-minute session of question and answers from the audience, and that will finish our symposium.
Company, forward!
Here, where you going?
Get out of my way.
General ain't to be disturbed. Strict order.
Orders be danged. We got a battle on our hands. General Houston. General Houston.
Well, Dave, what's ailing you?
Santa Anna's forces are ready to fight. What are you aiming to do about it?
Oh, just let them stew in the hot sun for a spell.
No. I do not agree with you. The Americans are afraid to fight. They will probably retreat again under cover of darkness. Let us retire like gentlemen to our siesta.
Tommy, do you know how to play a charge?
No, sir, General Houston. I only just learned one tune.
What's that?
Come to the Bower.
Well, that'll have to do, son. Come along. Get the men ready.
Break camp, men!
Gentlemen, this 21st day of April will someday go down in history as either the beginning or the end of Texas independence. I give you one thought to take with you across the open space and into the camp of Santa Anna. Remember the Alamo. All right, Tommy, play. Remember the Alamo! Charge! Turn out! Battle formation! Yes, sir. Remember the Alamo! Remember the Alamo!
Sam Houston's son, Andrew Jackson Houston, who was alive at that time, was so upset with the depiction of his father that he sued Republic Pictures for $1 million in a libel action. And I don't know if he ever got anywhere. I think Madge Roberts knows something about that. She might be able to enlighten us. But I'd like to ask the speakers to come up. And anyone who would like to ask questions will have a final opportunity to do so. Why don't you come up to the stage here? First of all, I want to thank each and every one of our speakers for taking the time and effort that they put into their presentations today. I think we all came away really appreciating the fact that this is a complicated subject of Texas history, but nonetheless it's something that's very fascinating and something that will keep us coming back for more and more each year. Please give me a round of applause for our speakers. Okay. Who has a question?
If you think it would be an area of fruitful conversation, I'd be interested in having the panel discuss the differences, if there was, between two different armies, the official governmental army of Texas and the so-called volunteers, and how they, after the San Jacinto experience, would, to some extent, free boot all over Texas, doing what they wanted to do, and in effect conquering land.
Steve? Or anybody else? Sounds like your question.
Yes. The army that formed immediately after Gonzales was the so-called Army of the People, and that was a completely volunteer force. Very early on, though, some very prominent people, including Stephen F. Austin and William Travis, understood that an army exclusively of volunteers was not going to get the job done. So Austin, who was then commanding the Army of the People, wrote the provisional government in San Felipe and said, we must form a regular army, which they thought was a good idea, and they named Sam Houston as general of the regular army, but stipulated that he would have no command over the volunteer army under the command of General Austin. There were a lot of officers in the regular army, but such was the animus of the egalitarian volunteers that at no point in the war did they have more than 100 enlisted men. So it was a classic case of a lot of chiefs and not enough Indians. And again, I'm going to say something good about Sam Houston. When he was a delegate at the Independence Convention, they offered him again command of the regular army, and he said, well, that's fine, but I won't accept it unless you give me command of all of the Texas forces under arms, which they did, which was the first time in the war that you would have unity of command. And after San Jacinto, the army that, actually gathered around Victoria was noted for its indiscipline. Noah Smithwick talks about an occasion where the only officer that tried to enforce, tried to pull rank was found in his tent with his brains blown out. So fragging did not begin in Vietnam. These were hard people to command, and they seemed actually to become even harder to command after San Jacinto during that period of the Republic. And I don't think freebooting is an exaggeration. I hope that answers your question.
Want to say anything about